All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Digital Novelist Podcast. My name is Keith Hayden, and you can't see him, but here on the red side of the screen, we can see Brian Sellnow. I have Brian Sellnow here, and we met through a local writers group, and I wanted to get him on this podcast to really just talk to him as another indie writer because when we met, he gave me a copy of his book, Arak of Varantia. I just finished it last week, and it was a really good read, really fun. So I got in touch with Brian, and I'm so happy to talk to him today on this episode. Brian, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Trying to find out how I can turn my camera on in Discord. I'm not used to this.
Oh, okay. You can turn it on if you want. There's a button. It should be on the bottom. It says turn on camera, but one of the tricks is you can't have cameras on in two places. So if you were using
Okay.
it to like in another program, a camera will only come on in one program. So close
Okay.
that program and then try and turn it on in Discord if you want. You don't have to turn on the camera. Some people, camera's not for them. People are just going to look at me, and some people are just going to listen. You know how it is today, these days.
Okay. Well, looks like it's working.
Okay. Well, I don't see you on my side. I don't see you on here, but it's all right. You don't have to if you don't want it on.
Okay.
So, first thing I wanted to ask you is why writing and a little bit about your writing journey and where you started. Oh, there he is. Hey, what's up, man?
Um. So I grew up on reading science fiction and fantasy. Um. Ever since I can remember, I've been reading Asimov and Bradbury and all the way to Zelazny, and also Conan the Barbarian and Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, and eventually Lord of the Rings. So I've always been kind of a fan of that. Sort of just grew up immersed in that type of fiction. Um, and then when I started writing Arak of Varantia, I had no intention of actually writing a book.
Mm,
I was hanging out on a website, just chatting with people, and uh, one of the boards that you could post on was just random stuff, jokes or recipes or whatever you wanted to do. Just for the heck of it, I wrote this little short scene about a hero, uh, fantasy hero, who wakes up in a dark place, um, no idea where he is.
mm,
There's a vampire uh, talking to him, telling him that she saved him from something.
mm-hmm.
And I posted that, and people thought it was interesting, and they asked me where it was from. I said, well, I wrote it. um, and then it just sort of, I wasn't really serious about writing, um, but it just sort of expanded in both directions
Cool.
towards the beginning and an end of the story, and eventually it just sort of coalesced into that book.
So this is your first book?
Yes, and as I said, it was before I actually decided to start writing. Um, it just sort of came together. I didn't really plan it out. I wasn't serious about writing. I
Yeah.
didn't know an awful lot about plot, pacing,
Yeah.
character development. So it's very much, I don't want to say like DIY project, I guess.
Yeah.
But I hope people that have read it said they enjoyed it, and that's good enough for me.
Yeah. I mean, and I could tell, and this is why, we were talking before we started recording. This is why I like reading indie fiction because that first book, I like how you described it as a DIY project. It's just you don't know really what you're doing and but you have an idea and you want to expand it or you have something that you want to say and the book feels like the right vehicle because I think oftentimes some writers, I've seen this recently, try and force it. They try and like, well, I've got to become a serious novelist or writer or whatever, and so they start forcing these things. And I feel like it's the first book is usually not like that. The first book is usually just like this idea, this character. For you, it was a scene, and then it's a pop off from there. And I wanted to, we can talk more about Arak of Varantia because, yeah, I did. One of my favorite scenes in the book, I think it's because I'm a big runner, but when he's climbing the stairs, man, can you talk a little bit about that scene and what it was like writing it and what was the inspiration behind it? Because I feel like that was a brutal experience.
So one of the other big influences on me when I was growing up was Lovecraft, and I don't know if you pick up. There's a few kind of Lovecraftian sort of uh, scenes in the book.
Yeah, the familiar, the summoning ceremony where he gets the familiar. That was I haven't read much Lovecraft, but I'm familiar with his work, and that was very Lovecraftian.
So there's a story I read once upon a time um, about this guy who lives in the underworld, and it's a Lovecraft story. It's really cool. I tried not to copy it too directly,
Yeah.
but he has to climb this tower, um, and he doesn't know where he is at first. But he starts climbing this tower, and eventually he finds himself in a crypt at the very top.
Mm.
And when he opens the door to the crypt, he finds himself at ground level uh, in a graveyard
Mm.
in the real world. And just the image of that guy, climbing this tower, kind of stuck with me. There's a similar kind of a thing in the books about Titan. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know if you've ever read those,
No. Mm-mm.
where the heroes have to climb this gigantic column, and that's actually a huge part of the story, and get to the center of the planet that they're on. So I thought that was kind of those scenes really kind of stuck with me, and I thought I'd try to
Mm-hmm.
do something similar. Um, Plus, I'd had a lot of time with Arak winding his way down into the underworld through the
Yeah.
catacombs,
Mm-hmm.
um, and I didn't want to try to repeat that on his way back up, so I sort of gave him a shortcut.
Right. And I thought that was a brilliant way to do that. And I noticed that with the structure. You know, you've got him and he meets the name of the guide. It escapes me right now.
The girl,
The guy who smells.
oh,
He's like,
Hades,
yeah, yeah.
the
He's
crazy old guy.
yeah, the crazy old guy that he meets and is kind of his guide down in the underworld. And then on the backside, when he gets to the other side, he meets the king under the mountain, and then he comes back up through that. I just thought of the writing that was really the most raw. I felt like that one hit me the most, and I just like the way it's like he's got these traps, and if he steps off, he might fall. I just saw it, and I was just like, wow, this seems like a really dangerous and treacherous situation. One of the things I wanted to ask you that I'm always interested in, especially since you started this from a scene and then you expanded it into a book. What was the writing process like as far as adding the other? It sounds like you took kind of a mishmash of different ideas and put them together. Talk to me a little bit about that.
So that's exactly what I did. Like I said, I started with the scene with the hero and the vampire, um, and I actually didn't do anything with it for quite a while. And then I sort of came up with this Lovecraftian scene about this old guy who goes on a rant about living in catacombs with monsters. And there's a part in the book in that where Hakadas
Yeah.
starts talking about all the horrible things he's seen, and
Mm-hmm.
so I wrote that as a completely separate scene. Um, and then I kind of thought about the hero and the vampire. I was like, well, how did he get there? Why is he there?
Right.
Where's he going to go from there? And I realized that I could put those two things together. So yeah, this guy's down in these catacombs. He's got this crazy old guy with him, trying to lead him around.
Mm-hmm.
The hero doesn't really realize, exactly what's going on down there. Maybe okay, there's rats and bats, but he doesn't realize that there's worse stuff in those catacombs.
Right.
So then I had to figure out a reason for him to go into the catacombs.
Of course.
Well, let's go ahead and go big. Let's give him a pretty good motivation. So he has to save his kingdom. He has to save his kingdom from what? And that's when I came up with the idea of the invading barbarians.
Mm-hmm.
And then he had to have some reason to go into the catacombs to save his kingdom. And that led me to the scepter, the skull scepter.
Mm-hmm.
And that obviously, there's a parallel with Lord of the Rings.
Mm-hmm.
Got this magical object.
Right.
You need to do something with that in order to save the day.
Right.
In the case of Lord of the Rings, they had to destroy it.
Mm-hmm.
I decided to go a little bit darker. I thought it'd be kind of fun. What if instead of having to destroy it, they actually had to use it?
Yeah.
And then after that, it was just a matter of figuring out where to start the book.
Mm-hmm.
And the first scene was him standing on the tower.
Right.
Because I just kind of like the imagery of this guy, this young prince standing on the tower with the winter wind whipping his hair around and looking out over his kingdom and figuring out how the heck he's going to try to stop this barbarian invasion.
Right.
After that, I decided to have his father already out of the picture.
Yeah.
So I had his father off fighting the barbarians, and Prince Arak had to figure out on his own with some advice,
Mm-hmm.
but he had to make his own decisions about what he was going to do. That kind of kicked off the idea of his character growth,
Mm-hmm.
starting from this kind of obnoxious kid and then growing into somebody who shows a little bit more maturity and responsibility.
Right. I felt like you did that really well. And I just like that you actually are taking us through the thought process, and I think this is good and this is one of the reasons I started this podcast. There's many reasons, but one of them is to demystify the writing process, because it is a process. There is a logical way that it goes down, and I feel like if you're watching this right now or listening to this and you just heard what Brian said, go back and listen to it again if you've never written a novel before, because this is how it works. It's like one thing leads to the other, and then you build things around that. Because I feel like a lot of writers feel like they have to get the whole big picture at once, and I need to have all my characters, I need to have all my scenes, I need to have all my themes, and then I need to find a way to work them in. You can do it that way, but when it's more organic like this, it does result in a better story because it just makes sense. It started in the catacombs with that scene, and then it's like, well, why is he down there? Okay, well, what makes sense? He wants to save his kingdom. He wants to get this magical artifact. Okay, why does he need the magical artifact? Well, he's got a barbarian invasion to stave off. Okay, now why is he going on this adventure? And then you mentioned the character growth. Do you think about it sometimes that way, or was it more of just like, I have this, I need that, I have that, I need this type of thing?
So it's the pantser versus plotter thing.
Yeah.
There are people who are very comfortable writing seat of the pants,
Mm-hmm.
making it up as they go, and there are people who they want to. I'm going to go from here to here, and this is everything that's going to happen in the meantime.
Mm-hmm.
And then they go back and they have this outline that they can follow when they write out their scenes.
Right.
I kind of alternate back and forth now. The first, like I said, it wasn't ever intended to be a novel. So it was very much seat of the pants.
Yeah.
I had to go through and add chapters in the middle or at the very
Mm-hmm.
beginning or at the very end. I don't know that it works out better. I think the novel is more authentic the way I wrote it.
Definitely.
I'm going to use that word.
Mm-hmm.
if I wrote it today, again, if I started from scratch right now, it would be a very different book.
Oh yeah, yeah, always.
I like to think that I've refined my writing techniques a little bit.
Yeah, you get better as you do it more. You're able to see, because I bet if you went back, and that was one of the things that I mentioned in my review of the book, that I could tell that it was a first pass type of thing. It was just a passion project, not a lot of editing on the back end. There were just definitely some typos and things like that, but that happens. I mean, I've been through three. My first novel, I had like three or four different passes, and there were still typos. I still find typos when I open it up. It's one of
There's
those
always one
things.
more lurking in there somewhere.
Exactly, and I think for the first one, it's just like you just got to shit it out. You just got to rip it out of you, and then it's like, okay, now I can go back and refine the craft. And um, I like that you think about it that way. One of the things I wanted to ask you is the time. How long did it take you to write this? Because it's a fairly compact book, and I like that. I like that. Um, Unlike some of the older style writers that you pulled from, you kept it concise. You kept it, okay, let's stay focused on the adventure and let's move him through. And then it had a very distinct beginning, middle, and end. How was the writing process like for you with this?
So again, I kind of wrote it in pieces, and I think that probably contributed to the fast pacing of the story, because I had scenes that I thought, okay, this is a cool scene, um, and then I just filled in around those scenes as needed.
Mm-hmm.
So I wasn't writing, okay, now I need 3,000 words for the next chapter. I never went through that kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
It was, how do I get from this scene to this scene? And I put in the minimal amount that I needed
Mm-hmm.
to explain what was going on, let people follow along with the story.
Right.
So I think the seat of the pants thing kind of worked in my favor for that.
Right. So did it take you 3 months, couple of weeks? How long was it before you had all of the pieces together and then you could put them out as a book?
Oh golly. So I wrote the original scenes a long time ago, um, and I was still working, so I didn't have time to spend dedicated to it to writing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm going to say it probably over the course of 4 or 5 years, to be
Wow.
honest. I wrote out some scenes, went back and filled in, wrote out some more. Um, and when it started to look like it was going to be an actual novel, I, that's when I started getting serious about, hey, I need to actually write this.
Oh, okay. You're back?
I think so.
Okay. I just sent you a message. Cool. Um, but yeah, you were talking about when you felt like you had a certain amount, and then that's where I cut off.
Yeah, it's kind of like, when you're playing a game or a sport or something, and suddenly you realize you can win. Like, oh,
Mm.
I need to try harder. So I realized that actually this could turn into a novel length story.
Yeah.
Um, so I went back and added some chapters at the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Tried to develop, okay, this is who Arak's father is.
Mm-hmm.
So I put in the chapter about him. Um, put in the very first chapter. Actually, put in the chapter about the shaman, the
Mm-hmm.
evil magic user dude.
Yeah.
I put that in front of that chapter.
Mm-hmm.
And then I realized I wanted to introduce Arak right at the very beginning because he's the main character.
Mm-hmm.
So I wrote a chapter with him as a kid when he's still learning how to man troops and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of also use that to showcase his nature,
Yeah.
where he's like, hey, let's go do this, and he doesn't really think about what he's doing,
Mm-hmm.
and he gets pissed off because it doesn't work.
Of course.
But he's not stupid. He's
Right.
just impetuous. So he's
Mm-hmm.
smart enough to listen to his general and say, okay, you were right.
Right.
What do I need to fix?
Right. Cool. Yeah, I saw all of it come together, and that's one of the things that's hard about writing a novel is when you're writing it, it's hard to see the whole because you're so you're at that writer's level. You're word by word, sentence by sentence. And even when you start having the chapters, it's not until you really go back and read all of it through that you can really appreciate, okay, that does this actually work? Is it a coherent story? And then even when you do that, you can't account for what the reader is actually going to focus in on or what's going to draw their attention. So I think of it like basically setting out a buffet. You know, we've got some salad over here, we've got some steak over there, some crab meat over there. Maybe salad, you hate salad, but crab meat is your thing. Okay, go get the crab meat. My job as the writer, our job as the writer, is to put as many options out there and as many layers. And some of these layers are totally subconscious. Like maybe you were thinking of Arak as like a bullheaded type of guy, impetuous, but I saw this kind of classic overall hero's journey. I mean, I saw that in the beginning, but very classic, you know, where he starts out, he has some skills, but he doesn't have it reined in. He's not a leader, but he needs to become a leader in order to save his kingdom. And that's exactly how the story kind of goes. It follows that arc. But I think that's one of the things I love about novel writing over shorter form is that you can explore so many different things through the story, through the characters, through the themes, and just scenarios, and you can just show so many different pictures. And as a writer, it helps you get better because you have to kind of stay on the same beat. Unlike when you're writing shorter stuff, to where you can kind of write some science fiction over there, you can write some fantasy over here, but you've got to kind of stay in the same pocket. I really like that.
Yeah, I also when I was growing up and still played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons.
Hmm,
So there's some probably motifs in the story
for sure.
that kind of follow that a little bit. But one thing that's interesting about playing Dungeons and Dragons is, you know, your character can be in some kind of horrible situation, but the players are still just joking around and having a good time. I kind of wanted to see if I could put some of that in the story, so I tried to insert some humor into the story now and then,
Hmm,
including some dark humor.
yeah, for sure.
Uh, so there's some scenes that I tried to make that were not necessarily lighthearted, but amusing.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah, I like that you included that because I feel like fantasy is not really known for humor exactly. I mean, it's a different type of humor usually, but that's not usually one. If somebody likes fantasy, they're not expecting to be laughing most of the time. You know, it's more about the adventure. It's more about the fantasy elements. How did they take a unique spin on the staples of the genre? And that's one of the things I wanted to ask you. It seems like you mentioned, you know, Asimov, Bradbury, and Lovecraft as kind of some of your motivations or some of your inspirations for writing. Arak of Varantia is very much a fantasy story. What made you decide to go full fantasy instead of sci-fi, which it seems like sci-fi tends to be more also your interest as well, but what made you kind of make that call?
well, going back to the Dungeons and Dragons thing, when you play D&D,
Mm-hmm.
you're playing a character, or if you're running the thing, then you're playing a whole bunch of different characters.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really kind of like interactive storytelling,
Yeah.
and that's just kind of what I was already used to doing. Um, and you know, there are science fiction role playing games, but the
Mm-hmm.
fantasy ones are obviously more prevalent.
For sure.
So trying to create characters in a fantasy setting and then figure out, you know, how they're going to act and trying to get into their heads was actually not too hard for me at all.
Cool. Yeah, I remember being in high school and I had friends that played D&D and I remember them like inviting me over. And I remember this one specific night I was at my best friend's place and they were all at the table and it seemed like they were having a great time. But I was like I wanted to do something else or something. So I felt like that was the day where I decided that like subconsciously that I was not going to get into D&D even though I liked the concept. Like I've played a ton of video games. I love Japanese role playing games, that type of thing. I'm a huge nerd, but I mean D&D just it was right there, but I didn't do it, and I don't know, mixed feelings about that because it seems like It is a lot of fun, and like you said, interactive storytelling is it is fun. It invokes the imagination, and it goes pairs well with writing fiction, especially fantasy.
Yeah, and I didn't want to just write out a Dungeons and Dragons adventure. It was,
Right,
my own world rules
for sure.
about how things work. And, so it's not the stereotypical. I tried to make the characters a little bit more interesting
Mm.
than just
Yeah,
standard. So I've got the changeling girl
yeah,
who lives in the underworld.
yep.
Um, I tried to make her more of an interesting character.
Mm.
When we don't really talk about changelings, but it used to be a pretty big thing.
Mm.
The elves are going to come take you away, and in her case, that's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
Uh, so I thought I'd kind of bring that into the story. I also, when I started writing it, I was
Mm.
also in the middle of reading books about the Knights of the Round Table and
Mm.
Robin Hood, and I kind of wanted to emulate that style of story just a little bit.
Yeah.
Obviously, not the writing style because that's kind of outmoded and hard to
Right.
read.
For sure.
But I kind of wanted to bring in some of those elements as well. So
Yeah.
you'll see some of that language in the book.
Yeah, I noticed that, especially in the beginning. Yeah, it had that kind of very medieval type. That's the way I describe it. I actually don't read a lot of fantasy, and that's why one of the reasons why wanted to contact you, because I was like, yeah, here's a fantasy book that I felt like I got into. It's not 1,000 pages long. It didn't take me like a year to read it because some of this fantasy. Damn.
Yeah, yeah. If something says epic or saga, I kind of steer away from it.
Yeah, if it's gonna take you a year to read it, and I get it. I know some books they need that too because they really. I think that what draws a lot of authors to fantasy is the world building. I mean, you can get so. I mean, Lord of the Rings is the classic example with the language and just the richness of the world. You can just really go very very deep. But it's deep, and you're asking a lot of your reader to do that. But there's some people who love those books. The
Yeah,
thicker,
I've
the
seen
better.
on the stories that I've critiqued for other authors. I've seen a lot of people who fall in love with their own fantasy world, and
Yes, for
I think
sure.
they saw Tolkien and oh yeah, I can do that too. Well, no, you can't. You're not
Yeah.
that good.
Yeah. I mean, and you're right. I think that's a perfect way to put it. They fall in love with their world and they forget that they're writing a story that hopefully they want other people to experience. And so it's a matter of direction too. Because if your camera is too always focused on the weeds and seeds and the birds and the bees of the world, then it's hard for the reader to understand, okay, where does this factor in? Yeah, it's beautiful, but what's the story? And I think that's what happens with a lot of fantasy authors.
Yeah, one thing I like to remind people of when I'm reading through their books is stories are always and every time about people doing something.
Right. Love it.
So you can build this huge fantasy world, um, but if nothing's happening, it's not a story. You can give us 4 pages of your character's backstory and tell us, how they grew up and what they believe in. But if he's not doing anything, it's not a story. So
Yep.
one of the things that, like I said, when I wrote this, I was moving from scene to scene and just filling in the gaps, and I think that
Mm.
that was actually a pretty helpful way to write it. Kept it moving.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think that is what a lot of authors, not just in fantasy, but in general, need to remember that you are telling a story. And if you want somebody who knows nothing about your world to get lost in it, then yeah, you have to consider that with your world building. Absolutely, you got to have world building in there, and you will have world building. I mean, I found that I used to think I was a terrible world builder, but I think because I was thinking about it from like the D&D kind of perspective in the fantasy, to where, like you said, you got to have the 4-page character bios and the stat sheets, and okay, now this is this land, and I've got to name it and do all of that stuff. And maybe for some people that works great, but for me, it doesn't really work. The world kind of just builds around the plot as I'm assembling the story. And I found that that's a much better way for me to do world building. It comes out very much like it did in Arak of Varantia, to where it feels organic. It feels like, okay, this world could have already been there. I just never discovered it before.
Yeah, one thing I did try to do, as I as it developed into a novel, is I tried to get more and more into Eric's head.
Yes,
So I tried to make sure I saw everything from his point of view,
absolutely.
um,
Yeah.
and tried to describe, what is he seeing, what is he feeling.
And I feel like you nailed that. I think that is what was a big draw to me because you're right. At the end of the day, it's people doing stuff, and to get to know people, that's one of the great things about literature and fiction is that you can get in somebody's head, literally, and you can get in their headspace. What are they thinking? What are they feeling? And then the reader experiences that, and it just deepens the whole experience. I feel like you did an excellent job with that.
Thank you.
One of the things that I really thought was cool was, and you mentioned it, we touched on it, but I want to go in deeper on it, is the skull scepter. Man, those after the the tower ascent scene, those were some of my favorite scenes when he's using the skull scepter, when he's kind of unlocking the power of it. Talk to me how you thought about visualizing that, and then the concept of the skull scepter, because I thought it was dope.
Okay, so I needed a reason for him to go into those catacombs and save his kingdom.
Mm,
Um, and the obvious answer for me was he has to go find some kind of really powerful weapon.
mm,
And I thought about making it, like some kind of magic sword where he could just, run around and chop people into pieces.
mm,
But it didn't seem to be that satisfying
mm.
because it seemed kind of mundane. And I didn't want this guy to turn into a superhero.
Right.
I wanted him to actually be a person with his own, weaknesses and limitations.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't want the skull scepter to be an all-powerful thing.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever he found, I wanted it to have limitations and have a reason why he wouldn't want to use it. Why it had to be hidden away.
Right.
So I came up with this idea for a. I wanted to bring magical elements into it, so I wanted something that would allow him to sort of cast magic spells,
Cool.
but there would be a good reason for him not to do it, and that's when I came up with the idea of necromantic magic.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's something you use if you have to,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not something you want to parade around and show off with.
Right. Yeah, and I think the way you did it in the story, it kind of comes in towards the final act, and to where he's not even ready for it in the middle. He's not ready for it in the beginning, surely not. But by the end, there is the way you describe him using it, and it is this this demonstration of, okay, what did you learn from this entire test of this book, and then these scenes come in, and yeah, I can tell when I've read enough indie fiction before. I can tell when a writer really finds their their stride with a book, because it's the same, especially with first books. It was for mine, surely, where the first, I don't know, few chapters, first half, you can tell there's a lot of experimentation going on. There's some holding back because you've never done this before. You don't know how to really start with what you want the vision to be. You know what the vision is, but then you're not really sure how to get it on the paper. But yeah, I could tell by the time you got to those scenes, you had really gotten it dialed in, and you were like, okay, we're going straight to the finish.
Um, and there's some, I guess, kind of, like I said, I wanted to include some dark humor in it.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, I was kind of laughing at the scene with the high priest. It's like, oh, you're gonna use a magic spell on me? What do you think about this?
Yeah. Yeah, I like that last action sequence too. That's one of the things that I'm trying to improve on is I think I'm good at one-on-one action sequences, but doing like this like a kind of siege group battle type of thing, I've never really done those types of things before. But I like the way you did it in this one.
Yeah, and in addition to D&D, I played war games with my friends, so I kind of learned a little bit about maneuvering armies around and all the problems with marching and trying to keep things in order. Um,
Yeah.
One of the cool things that worked for me well was when I realized what I could do with this skull scepter idea was that Eric doesn't really have to worry about uh, how his soldiers are eating or what kind of clothes they wear.
Right. Yeah.
'Cause, they don't really complain about anything.
Right.
They just follow orders. They're
Yeah.
not really, yeah, they don't have a lot of initiative, but they'll do what he tells them to do.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to spoil the whole book I mean, we've talked about it a lot for people who are watching or listening. You should definitely check out Arak of Varantia if you like a really concise, to the point, fun adventure. And that's what I walked away from it. I was like, this is just a fun story. It's a great world, and I love the characters. And I like that you were just talking about marching and things like that. And that got me to something else that we connect on is that we're both military veterans,
Yeah.
Air Force in particular. Was there any of that that found its way into the book or the lifestyle or the culture that made its way into this work?
Not into this one, but once I realized that writing a novel was something I enjoyed doing
Mm-hmm.
and that people liked reading it, I
Mm-hmm.
actually started a second novel.
Nice.
And this one draws heavily on my experiences in the military,
Cool.
as well as my knowledge as a linguist, because that's what I did in the military.
Nice.
I was in special operations, so I created a story about a spaceship that does special operations, clandestine stuff, science in a science fiction space opera sort of atmosphere. Um, I've been to a bunch of different countries and learned, a lot about different cultures. Um, and then one of the things that one of my other hobbies is singing in barbershop quartet.
Wow.
And I thought, I'm going to integrate that into the story too. So I wrote this story about this spaceship that does special ops, and they get sent off to do this mission, and they run into space aliens. They're six-legged lizards, and the lizards communicate by singing. So their vocabulary is actually fairly small, but because they change their tempo and rhythm and chord structures, uh, that's how they convey meaning in their communications.
That is
And
freaking
it's really
cool.
hard for the two to communicate. The humans and the aliens are like trying to figure out how to talk to each other.
Yeah. I
And that's
like
a
that.
yeah, it's going to be fun. Right now, there's a publisher actually looking at the book.
Nice.
They asked me to send them the entire book, so I'm pretty stoked about that.
Great.
Yeah, Arak of Varantia, I never really did any marketing. It
Of
was
course
just
not.
hey, let's see if I can do this, and then I
Mm-hmm.
put it on Kindle to see if anybody would be interested. But
Right.
I never really tried to push it, and hey, I'm a professional author kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
This is the novel where I'm like, okay, I'm gonna write a good novel.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm hoping that it'll do well.
Yeah, it sounds great. I really like the idea of the singing aliens. Like, I can just picture it. There's six legs, and they're just like, oh. So something much better than that, I'm sure. Um, but yeah, you're right about because I was the same way with my first book. My first book was nonfiction, and I didn't really try and push it at all. I just kind of put it up and published it. But then when I wrote my first novel, which was my second book, that was when I made the same decision as you. I was basically like, okay, let me see about this marketing thing and how I can actually get eyes on this book. And it sounds like you're going towards more of the traditional publishing route, but same deal. You start it. I think you're at the point where a lot of authors are afraid of. It's like, okay, I wrote the book. Now, how do I get it out into the world and get it into the hands of the right people? How has your experience been so far with that?
Oh, well, one of the cool things is being retired military.
Mm,
Um, I don't need to really do anything for money if I don't want to.
right.
So I'm like to be considered to a professional author when I get paid to write,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm not going to worry about buying groceries if my books don't sell.
Yeah. It's a nice place to be.
um, So that's why I never really felt any pressure to do any marketing for Arak of Varantia.
Right. Yeah.
Self-publishing thing, honestly, is a lot of work.
It is.
Um,
Yeah.
and I'm just not that motivated to work that hard.
Mm.
So uh, if a publisher, I'll write something. I've written a bunch of short stories,
Mm.
and I shopped them around. Did a couple of horror stories and
Mm.
sent them off to magazines that don't pay you for them.
Yeah.
It's
They
just,
don't.
hey,
Yeah.
go publish your story because we liked it.
Mm.
And that's fine.
Mm.
If people enjoy reading the story, I enjoy writing it. That's enough for me.
Nice. I like how you keep it simple like that because yeah, I'm on the self-publishing side and it is a ton of work. It's yeah, but you have to pick your poison. And I think this is where a lot of authors, when they stand at that fork in the road, they see, well, if I go traditional publishing like you, then I've got to wait for somebody to give me permission. I mean, I know people who've queried hundreds of times, and it's depending on your story, it can be very difficult to even get a request for a full manuscript, let alone, okay, we're going to actually give you an advance and we're going to make this book happen. That it's the dream for a lot of authors, but to get to that point is a lot of work. And then it requires on the front end that kind of reworking, because you may get a publisher that says yes, but change this, add this, take that out, alter this, whatever, and then all of a sudden your work looks a little bit different than it did going in. Whereas on the indie side where I'm at, you do front load everything. You do everything yourself, but you maintain that creative flexibility that you have with your story. But either way, it's a necessary, if you want your actually, because, and I assume anytime I tell people, I always preface on this podcast that this assumes that you are writing for other people. If you're just writing, journaling, and you like writing stories, but you really don't care about making a living or getting people to read it, then you can totally ignore what I just said. But that I found that for most authors, that's not the case. They want either money for their effort or they want recognition for having people, like you said, they enjoyed the story. I want to know that they enjoyed the story and that it's been distributed in a place where people can enjoy the story. That's just how I think about it. Oh, it looks like you're back.
Okay. Uh, yeah. So if if I wrote Arak of Varantia today, it would be a much different story.
Of course.
Um, if somebody says, hey, I think this could make your story better, I don't have a problem listening to criticism and saying, yeah, maybe you're right.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but if you have a story to tell, I think you're the only one who can tell that story.
Absolutely.
So if you want to write a novel or even a short story, sit down and do it.
Yeah.
Don't, gosh, I wish I was a writer so I could write a story. Well, if you sit down and start writing a story, you're a writer.
There it is. Absolutely. One of the questions I wrote down to ask you is, what's your favorite part of the book? I mean, we all have, you write the whole thing, and then some parts are harder than others just because, the motivation, maybe you're not so fired up about the scene. But what's your favorite part?
Um, Probably the ending, actually, the last chapter,
Hmm.
because I had all this novel in my head. I got all this, mayhem and swords and sorcery and people uh, getting killed. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I kind of wanted, how do I bring it all together and how do I want people to feel when it ends?
Mm-hmm.
And it took me a while to figure out what kind of ending I wanted.
Mm-hmm.
But then we get to the end and we see that Arak's kind of matured quite a bit. And he's turned into a little bit more philosophical person. He
Mm-hmm.
kind of thinks about the future instead of what he wants to do right now.
Yeah.
He's he's a little bit more relaxed. So I'm actually I'm pretty happy with the closing lines of the story.
Yeah. I thought they were really good. I really enjoyed it. That it did have that different tone than the beginning, where it's like, okay, he's at war or he's getting ready to fight. He's going in to the to the jaws of the beast, and then he comes out the other end a changed man. And I liked that very simple but very clear arc. And I could tell by the way you talk about it that you did think about it this way. And I can tell you the result was a fun story, a good read.
Well, that's all I was shooting for.
So you said the next thing is this sci-fi space opera. When can we expect to see that? Anytime soon?
I have no idea. I'm still fairly new to the writing process. I've never worked with a book publisher before.
Mm-hmm.
So about a month ago, well, originally I sent a submission in, and it was a summary of a short summary, the first 3 chapters.
Mm-hmm.
And after a couple months, they wrote back and said, "Hey, we want the full manuscript." Okay.
Nice.
So and of course, last minute editing. I was like, "Oh yeah, now it's got to be perfect."
Right, right. Yeah,
I spent a few frantic hours doing that. I was
yeah,
like, I can't think of anything to do to make it better. So
yeah.
I sent it in. That was a couple months ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I could get an email tomorrow saying, we decided not to move forward with this. Who knows?
Yeah.
If that happens, I'll send it to somebody else.
So what are you doing in the meantime? Are you working on another story or something else?
So I've actually written a second story, uh, a sequel to that, and and that's done. I got to the end at the very end. And that story is in the process of going through the critique website that I hang out on
Mm-hmm.
called Critters,
Yeah.
and people are commenting on the chapters. So I need to make some changes and refinements to that. I actually started on the third story, which kind of wraps up things, wraps it all together.
Okay.
And I've got an idea of how I want that story to progress and end. But that kind of got interrupted because I came up with another idea, and it's going to be novella length,
Mm-hmm.
uh, about a girl who gets kidnapped as a baby,
Mm-hmm.
and she gets taken to the land of the dead. Um, so she's a baby, and she gets raised by vampires. And there's ghouls and werewolves running around. And when she turns 16, she has to go back to the real world and find her parents and figure out why she was kidnapped.
Hmm. Interesting. I like that.
Yeah, it's turning out to be a fun story, and it's narrated by a raven, and the raven is actually a spirit guide. He's
Mm-hmm.
not a real raven; he's actually kind of a supernatural
Yeah.
creature,
Mm-hmm.
and he kind of shuttles people back and forth between the land of the living and the land of the dead,
Mm-hmm.
and he accompanies her, so it's all from his point of view,
Right.
and that's turning out to be fun.
Cool. So you've got a couple of different projects that you're working on, and where can people find you? Where can people find your work online or in person or wherever you hang out?
So I don't really have an author website or anything.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, with a small number of uh, stories that I have published, it didn't really seem worthwhile, to be
Mm-hmm.
honest. I've got a story that's out in Dark Horses magazine,
Okay.
and people that read that said they enjoyed it. But it's a
Nice.
short horror story.
Nice.
Um, if you really want to read some of what I've done, what I would suggest for any author, actually, is joining the Critters website. And that's a site where authors post their own work. But in order to have your work critiqued, you're required to critique other people's work.
Right.
So you look at somebody else's story, maybe it's a chapter from a novel, or maybe it's a short story, and you say, okay, this is why this worked. This is what I liked. Um, this didn't work for me, and this is why.
Mm-hmm.
That's been very helpful for me to develop my own abilities,
Mm-hmm.
because when you do that, you suddenly realize, oh, maybe I did the same thing. And it
Right.
forces you to look at your own work with a critical eye.
Right.
Go back and look at the pacing or the character development or maybe the world building. figure
Yeah.
out, okay, was there all action, no dialogue? Was it the other way around?
Right.
Is something happening, or is it too much information at once
Mm-hmm.
with no action at all?
Yeah.
Um, so you can, and then you can, if you have a novel, obviously 70,000 words, you're not going to just put that on a web page and say, everybody, what do you think?
Mm-hmm.
But they have a process where if somebody wants to read an entire novel,
Mm-hmm.
you can do that as a separate kind of a thing.
Nice.
I've had a few people read through my novels there. So not only would you actually get to read my work, but you get to tell me exactly what you think of it and how it
Mm-hmm.
could be better.
Yeah. No, I like that. Critters. I think you mentioned that to me, and I'll put a link in the description of this video, somewhere around this video or this podcast, where you can check out Critters and you can find Brian Sellnow. I wanted to make sure I said it. I said it right because Sellnow, not Sell Now, right?
Either way, it's a
Either way.
German name.
Okay. At first, I have to admit, when I first saw it, I thought it was a pen name because I was like, Sell Now, like Brian Sell Now. I was like, man,
I
that's
thought
a
about coming up with a pen name, but by now it seems too late.
yeah, yeah. You're already out there, man. Don't worry, you're in safe hands. But thanks for taking the time to meet with me this morning. I really enjoyed talking with you. And do you have any final words of advice? Because most of this audience, they are aspiring writers or people who want to generally write long form fiction, which I'm finding is um, it feels rarer and rarer just because the social media and the internet tends to reward short bites of writing, and everybody calls themselves a writer now, but very few can call themselves novelists. What would you have to say to them?
So like I said, everybody, if you've got a story to write, then you're the only one that can write it. Um, and coming up with ideas, I can do that all day long. Actually writing it out, sitting down and figuring out the plot and the pacing, um, that's the hard part.
Yeah,
I've sat there for 5 minutes, like, okay, what is the perfect word I need to use here?
yeah.
Um, and then you'll have those moments, but really the best advice that I've heard is get your butt in the seat and start writing.
And do it often too. And the more you do it, the easier it will get to. What I found as being a novelist is that it's getting past your own voice. It's doing it every day too, because you have that, especially after you finish your first book or your first story. When you sit down to write the next one, you're like, can I do this again? Can I go through it? Can I figure out something interesting to say? Or was the first time just a total fluke? Like,
Yeah, you need to be in your character's head.
mm,
You need to say, not I'm going to write a story about a princess. You need to say I am that princess,
right,
and here's what's happening, and here's what I'm going to do about it.
right.
I think if you do that, you'll be a lot more motivated to write, and I think it'll make your writing a lot better.
Absolutely. Well, it's been a pleasure, Brian. Thanks for coming on to this podcast, and thank you, listener or watcher, for watching the Digital Novelist Podcast. My name is Keith Hayden. You can find me at keithhayden.net. I'm literally on every social platform. So you can find me at KH_author. My latest novel is a supernatural horror novel called Gates of Okinawa. It takes place in Okinawa, Japan. It's from a U.S. military spouse's perspective while she fights demons in order to save the island with her students, with a group of her students. That's the story. It's due out November 2024 at the end of this month. I'm in a sprint right now, a dash to the end, and it is rough, but I'm getting through it. You'll find my links in the description. Be sure to check out critters.com where you'll find Brian Sellnow's work. Arak of Varantia, great book. Pick it up. It's on Amazon. Don't forget to check out and give Brian a shout out if you see him online. Thanks a lot for watching or listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.